The bustling airport terminal was alive with the usual chaos of travelers. Lines stretched endlessly, announcements echoed from every corner, and tired passengers shuffled to their gates. Among them was David Carter, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, carrying only a sleek leather briefcase. His calm and confident demeanor stood out in the crowd. David was no ordinary passenger. He had chosen to dress modestly for the flight, wearing a simple navy blue suit. As he approached the boarding gate, he caught the attention of the flight attendant, Sandra Blake, who stood at the entrance with a bright but calculated smile. "Good afternoon," David greeted politely, handing over his boarding pass. Sandra glanced at the pass and then at him. A flicker of something unkind passed through her eyes before she forced her smile back. "Welcome aboard," she said, but there was a sharpness in her tone that didn't go unnoticed by David. David nodded and walked onto the plane, brushing off the odd interaction. He was used to moments like these, quick, subtle dismissals that people thought he wouldn't notice. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was spacious and elegant, with wide leather seats and attentive staff bustling to prepare for takeoff. David found his seat by the window, quietly settling in. Sandra, now making her rounds, seemed to linger near David's seat more than necessary. She checked on the passengers around him with exaggerated friendliness, but when it came to David, her smile vanished. "Excuse me," David said politely. "Could I trouble you for some water?" Sandra gave him a tight-lipped look. "We'll be serving drinks shortly," she replied curtly and walked away without another word. The passenger in the seat across from David, an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, frowned at the interaction. She leaned toward her husband. "Did you see that?" "The way she spoke to him," she whispered. Her husband, adjusting his glasses, gave a small nod. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Sandra continued her duties. However, her demeanor toward David grew colder with each interaction. When another passenger in first class requested a pillow, Sandra rushed to assist with a cheery smile. When David asked for the same, she seemed annoyed and reluctant, tossing it onto his seat without a word. By now, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Mrs. Green wasn't the only one noticing Sandra's behavior. A younger couple sitting nearby exchanged uneasy glances. David, however, remained calm. He leaned back in his seat, seemingly unfazed by Sandra's attitude. But there was a quiet resolve in his eyes that hinted at a deeper understanding of the situation. Things escalated when Sandra made an announcement to the first-class passengers, asking if anyone needed assistance. David, needing help with adjusting his seat, raised his hand. Sandra hesitated, looking around as if she hadn't seen him. When no one else responded, she reluctantly approached. "Yes," she said, her tone flat. David gestured to the seat controls. "I think this might be stuck." Sandra sighed loudly, making a point to let everyone know she was being inconvenienced. "It's not stuck," she snapped. "You're just not pressing it right." She leaned over, pressed the button once, and the seat adjusted. "There, happy now." Several passengers exchanged disapproving looks. Mrs. Green couldn't hold back any longer. "Excuse me, young lady," she said sharply. "That's no way to speak to a paying customer." Sandra turned to Mrs. Green, her smile icy. "I'm doing my job, Mom." "Not very well, it seems," Mrs. Green muttered under her breath. Sandra walked away, but the damage had been done. The air in the cabin felt heavy, and David's silence only amplified the discomfort. He simply adjusted his seat and opened a book, choosing to focus on his reading rather than the hostility directed his way. But Mrs. Green wasn't done. She leaned over to David. "You handled that well, young man," she said softly. "But don't let her get away with it." David smiled faintly. "Thank you, ma'am. I've dealt with worse." His calmness intrigued her. There was something about him that seemed out of place, not in a bad way, but in a way that suggested there was more to him than met the eye. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Sandra continued her rounds, but it was clear she was avoiding David. Other passengers whispered among themselves, some visibly upset by what they had witnessed. The stage was set, and the tension in the first-class cabin was undeniable. The audience watching this story would already be hooked, asking themselves, who is David Carter? Why is Sandra acting this way? And how will this all unfold? Little did Sandra know, her behavior was about to lead to consequences far beyond her imagination. Whispers in the cabin. As the plane climbed into the sky, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. The first-class passengers settled into their seats, some scrolling on their devices, others chatting quietly. Yet, a peculiar energy lingered in the air. Everyone had noticed Sandra's hostility toward David, and it wasn't sitting well with them. David, meanwhile, sat calmly by the window, gazing out at the clouds. He had dealt with unfair treatment before and knew how to pick his battles. For now, silence was his weapon. But others weren't so willing to let the incident slide. Across the aisle, Mrs. Green leaned closer to her husband. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," she whispered, her voice filled with indignation. "That flight attendant has no right to treat him like that." Her husband, a quiet man with kind eyes, nodded. "Maybe we should say something," he suggested. Before Mrs. Green could respond, the young couple seated nearby joined the conversation. The woman, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, glanced toward David. "I don't know him, but he seems like such a gentleman. Why would she be so rude to him?" The man sitting beside her shrugged. "People like that. Sometimes they think they're better than others. It's disgusting." The murmurs weren't lost on Sandra. As she walked down the aisle with a tray of drinks, she caught snippets of their conversation. Her face tightened, and her steps grew brisker. When she reached David's seat, she paused, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked curtly. David looked up from his book. "Water would be fine. Thank you." Sandra poured the water, but her hand trembled slightly. The glass tipped, spilling water onto David's tray table. "Oh dear," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "I guess that was clumsy of me." Several gasps echoed through the cabin. Mrs. Green shot out of her seat. "That wasn't clumsy, young lady. That was intentional," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. Sandra turned to Mrs. Green, her face flushed with anger. "Excuse me, ma'am, but I think you're mistaken," she replied, trying to keep her composure. "I don't think so," Mrs. Green fired back. "You've been targeting this man since the moment he boarded the plane. And let me tell you, everyone here sees it." The tension was thick now. David grabbed a napkin and calmly wiped the water from his table. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady. "No harm done." But Mrs. Green wasn't backing down. She pointed a finger at Sandra. "You should be ashamed of yourself. This man has been nothing but polite, and you've treated him like he doesn't belong here." The passengers nearby began murmuring in agreement. Sandra's confidence wavered. She straightened her posture and walked back toward the galley, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. As the cabin quieted, the whispers grew louder among the passengers. "Why do you think she's acting like that?" the young woman asked, leaning closer to her partner. "Maybe she thinks he doesn't belong in first class," he replied. "That's ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "It's 2024. Why are people still acting like this?" Meanwhile, David remained calm, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable, perhaps frustration, perhaps patience. Mrs. Green leaned over again. "You're a good man for not losing your temper," she said softly. David chuckled lightly. "Sometimes losing your temper gives them what they want," he replied. "It's better to stay calm and let them reveal themselves." Mrs. Green tilted her head, studying him. There was something different about David, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. He carried himself with an air of dignity that spoke of experience and wisdom. "You're a special one, aren't you?" she asked with a knowing smile. David didn't respond, but his faint smile hinted at a story waiting to be told. At the back of the plane, Sandra was fuming. She paced the galley, her thoughts racing. "Who does that old woman think she is?" she muttered under her breath. "And that man," sitting there so smugly. Who does he think he is? But as Sandra's anger boiled over, she failed to notice one of her colleagues, Emma, standing nearby. Emma, a younger flight attendant with kind eyes, had seen everything. "Sandra, maybe you should calm down," she suggested gently. Sandra whipped around to face her. "Calm down. Did you hear how that old bat talked to me?" Emma hesitated. "I heard her defending a passenger you've been rude to all flight." Sandra's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. People like him think they're entitled to everything." Emma's jaw tightened. "People like him? Sandra, you're way out of line." Back in the first-class cabin, David reached into his bag and pulled out a sleek tablet. Mrs. Green watched curiously as he typed something quickly before placing it back. "What's that?" she asked. David smiled faintly. "Just a little reminder that kindness always wins in the end," he replied cryptically. The passengers leaned back in their seats, the atmosphere heavy with suspense. The story was only beginning, and no one could have guessed what secrets David Carter was keeping, or what surprises lay ahead for Sandra. Secrets began to surface. The atmosphere in the cabin remained tense as the flight continued. Sandra had returned to her duties but was noticeably avoiding David's section. Passengers whispered amongst themselves, their curiosity about the calm yet mysterious man growing with each passing moment. David sat quietly, flipping through an old leather-bound notebook. His calm demeanor only heightened the intrigue. Across the aisle, Mrs. Green couldn't help but watch him. Something about him seemed different, his posture, his confidence, and the way he carried himself. "Excuse me," she finally said, leaning toward him. "I hope I'm not bothering you, but I couldn't help noticing how well you handled that situation earlier. Most people would have lost their temper." David looked up and smiled politely. "Life has taught me that anger often leads to more trouble. Staying calm helps you see things clearly," he replied. Mrs. Green nodded, but her curiosity got the better of her. "If you don't mind me asking, what do you do? You seem important." David chuckled softly. "I'm just someone who believes in hard work and fairness," he said cryptically, leaving her with more questions than answers. Meanwhile, in the galley, Emma, the younger flight attendant, decided she'd had enough of Sandra's attitude. She approached her colleague with a firm expression. "Sandra, we need to talk," Emma said, crossing her arms. Sandra raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "You know exactly what," Emma replied. "The way you've been treating that passenger, David, it's unacceptable. Everyone sees it, and it's making people uncomfortable." Sandra rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. He's just another entitled guy who thinks he deserves special treatment." Emma frowned. "Entitled? You have no idea who he is, do you?" Sandra hesitated. "What are you talking about?" "I overheard some of the other passengers talking," Emma said, lowering her voice. "Apparently, David Carter isn't just any passenger. He's—" She trailed off, unsure if she should reveal what she'd learned. Sandra leaned in, her curiosity piqued despite her irritation. "He's what?" Emma hesitated but finally sighed. "Let's just say he's someone you really don't want to mess with." Sandra scoffed, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Back in first class, a businessman named Mr. Thompson, seated a few rows behind David, tapped his assistant on the shoulder. "Do you recognize him?" Mr. Thompson whispered, nodding toward David. The assistant squinted. "No, should I?" Mr. Thompson leaned closer. "That's David Carter. I'm almost certain of it. He's one of the youngest tech billionaires in the country. Runs a charity for veterans, too." The assistant's eyes widened. "You're kidding. What's he doing flying commercial?" Mr. Thompson shrugged. "Who knows? But if that flight attendant knew who she was dealing with, she'd be a lot more careful." Their conversation wasn't as quiet as they thought. Several passengers overheard, and soon, whispers began to ripple through the cabin like wildfire. Mrs. Green, catching wind of the rumors, looked at David with renewed interest. "Is it true?" she asked softly. David tilted his head. Is what true? She leaned in closer. Are you someone important? People are saying you're a billionaire. David chuckled lightly. Labels don't matter much to me. What's important is how we treat one another, don't you think? But his answer didn't satisfy Mrs. Green. She could see that there was more to the story, and she wasn't the only one. Sandra returned to the cabin, her forced smile back in place. She glanced at David, but this time there was hesitation in her gaze. The whispers around her had reached a crescendo, and she couldn't ignore the growing attention David was receiving. When she reached his row, she hesitated before speaking. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone more subdued than before. David looked up, surprised by the sudden change in her demeanor. "No, thank you. I'm fine," he said calmly. Sandra nodded quickly and moved on, but her unease was palpable. As the flight continued, Emma approached David with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to say I admire the work your foundation does for veterans," she said softly. David's expression softened. "Thank you, Emma. It means a lot to hear that." Sandra, overhearing the exchange, froze in her tracks. She turned to Emma, her face pale. "Wait. His foundation. What are you talking about?" Emma gave her a sharp look. "You really don't know, do you? David Carter is the founder of the Veterans Hope Initiative. He's helped thousands of veterans transition back into civilian life, and he's one of the most respected philanthropists in the country." Sandra's heart sank. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, and Sandra could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze. She had misjudged David, and now her actions were under scrutiny. David, however, remained calm and composed, as if he knew this moment was inevitable. The stage was set for the next twist in the journey, and the passengers couldn't wait to see how the story would unfold. The weight of regret. Sandra sat in the galley, her heart racing and her palms clammy. The realization that David Carter, a man she had treated with disrespect, was not just any passenger but a billionaire philanthropist weighed heavily on her. The whispered conversations of the passengers about his achievements had reached her ears, and each word felt like a dagger to her pride. In first class, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Passengers who had been silent earlier were now eager to talk to David. Some even offered him their cards, hoping to connect with the influential man once the flight landed. A young mother sitting across from David leaned over, her baby on her lap. "Mr. Carter, I just want to thank you for what you do for veterans. My brother served, and your organization helped him get back on his feet." David gave her a gentle smile. "I'm glad to hear that. It's the people like your brother who inspire me to keep going." Sandra, hearing this from a distance, felt her stomach churn. She had assumed David was just an ordinary man, and now, with every passing moment, her mistake grew more glaring. In the back of the plane, Emma whispered to another flight attendant, Mark. "I told her not to judge people by appearances, but she never listens," Emma said, shaking her head. Mark frowned. "Well, she's learning the hard way. I just hope she makes it right before it's too late." Meanwhile, Sandra couldn't bring herself to face David, but avoiding him only made the situation worse. Passengers were looking at her now, not with curiosity but with judgment. They had seen how she had dismissed him earlier, and now they were piecing together the full story. Unable to sit with her guilt any longer, Sandra stood and made her way to David's seat. Her steps were slow and hesitant, and the eyes of the passengers followed her every move. When she reached him, David looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling slightly. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you earlier. It was wrong of me, and I deeply regret my actions." David studied her for a moment, his face giving nothing away. Then he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply, his tone neither cold nor warm. Sandra felt a small wave of relief, but it was short-lived. "Thank you," she said quietly, then turned to leave, but David's next words stopped her in her tracks. "You know," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's easy to make judgments about people based on appearances. I've faced it my whole life. But what really matters is what you do after you realize you were wrong." Sandra turned back to him, her face pale. I understand," she said softly, though she wasn't sure she fully did. The cabin grew quieter as the exchange settled in. Passengers who had been eavesdropping nodded approvingly at David's words. Mrs. Green, who had been one of David's early supporters, smiled to herself. "Class isn't about where you sit," she muttered to the businessman beside her. "It's about how you treat people." The businessman chuckled. Truer words have never been spoken. As the flight continued, Sandra returned to her duties, but her confidence was shaken. She tried to make amends with other passengers, offering extra snacks and drinks, but the damage had been done. Emma approached her during a quiet moment. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. Sandra sighed. "Not great. I messed up, and everyone knows it." Emma placed a hand on her shoulder. "The important thing is that you're trying to make it right. That's more than some people would do." Back in his seat, David returned to his notebook, jotting down ideas for his next project. He seemed unaffected by the chaos around him, but inside, he was thinking about the bigger picture. He had faced discrimination before, and he knew he would face it again. But each time, it reminded him why his work mattered so much. As the plane began its descent, the passengers could sense that this flight was one they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Sandra's regret, David's grace, and the lessons learned had left a lasting impression on everyone. But there was still one question lingering in the air. What would happen when the plane landed? The shocking revelation. As the plane touched down, the passengers slowly began to gather their belongings. The once vibrant chatter in the cabin was now subdued, with some still reflecting on the awkward tension that had been hanging in the air. Sandra moved quickly, gathering the last of the service cards, her face flushed with the weight of her earlier mistake. David Carter was one of the last to disembark, calmly standing up from his seat. Passengers continued to whisper about him as they passed, some offering a quick nod of acknowledgement, others still too stunned by the earlier events to speak. Sandra, however, kept her distance, avoiding eye contact with him as she cleared the aisle. As the line of passengers moved toward the exit, Sandra couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation. "I can't believe that was him. Did you know? He's one of the largest investors in tech startups. Philanthropist, too. He's helped fund several education projects for underprivileged kids." The weight of what she had done began to press down on her chest. She couldn't shake the realization that she had mistreated someone so important, someone who had made a difference in the world. She had been so quick to judge him based on his appearance, so confident in her assumptions. Now that confidence felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. As Sandra pushed the service cart toward the back, her supervisor, Janice, approached her with a smile. "Sandra, great job today. We've got another flight coming up in an hour. I'll need you to be ready." Sandra nodded, but she wasn't really listening. Her mind was still back on the flight, on the way she had treated David, and the humiliation she now felt. "Are you okay?" Janice asked, noticing the shift in Sandra's demeanor. I messed up," Sandra admitted, her voice low. "I judged a man based on how he looked, and I treated him terribly. And it turns out, he's a billionaire." Janice's expression softened. "You're not the first person to make a mistake like that. What matters is what you do next. You can't change the past, but you can learn from it and do better going forward." Sandra took a deep breath. "You're right. I just wish I could make it right." Meanwhile, David was on his way to the terminal, his thoughts elsewhere. As he walked through the bustling airport, he didn't notice the attention his presence was attracting. Several people recognized him now that he had disembarked, and whispers followed in his wake. What Sandra didn't know, however, was that David had been watching her the entire time. He had seen the way she avoided him after their exchange, the way her face had turned pale with guilt, and he had decided to do something about it. David reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. It was one he rarely gave out to just anyone, but today felt different. As he turned back toward the gate, he spotted Sandra near the entrance to the crew area, looking lost in thought. He approached her quietly, careful not to startle her. "Excuse me, Sandra." David's voice was calm but firm. Sandra looked up, startled. When she saw who it was, her heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, her face going even paler. "Look," David began, his tone soft but sincere. "I want you to know something. What happened today wasn't easy for either of us. I understand how hard it must be to realize your mistake, but I also know you're a good person. We all make mistakes. The important thing is what we do after that." Sandra swallowed hard, fighting back tears. I don't know how to make it right," she whispered, the weight of her mistake crushing her. David extended the business card toward her. "Here, I'd like to offer you something. I run several mentorship programs, and I think you could be a great fit. It might not erase what happened, but it's a way to make things better, for both of us." Sandra took the card, her hands shaking slightly. "You're offering me a chance to work with you?" she asked in disbelief. David smiled gently. "Yes, because I believe in second chances, and I think you deserve one." As the reality of what was happening sank in, Sandra felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. In a way, she had received her redemption. It wasn't just the apology from David that mattered, but his willingness to help her grow beyond her mistake. She realized that what he had given her was more valuable than any apology or forgiveness. It was an opportunity to learn and become better. Later, as the plane took off for its next destination, Sandra couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward David. His actions had shown her that kindness and understanding could come from even the most unexpected places. She knew she still had much to learn, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was on the right path. David, on the other hand, returned to his seat quietly, his mind already on the next steps of his mission to help others. He had faced many challenges in his life, but today had been a reminder that doing the right thing could change lives, even in small, unassuming ways. The unforeseen turnaround. The days following the incident on the flight were a whirlwind for Sandra. After receiving David's business card and his offer of mentorship, she had felt a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Never in her life had she expected a simple mistake to turn into such an opportunity. She had thought she might never see David again, but here she was, preparing for their first meeting. Sandra arrived at the office building a week later, the address on the business card gleaming in the sunlight. It looked like any other corporate building, sleek and modern, but it was also filled with an air of power and success that made Sandra nervous. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by a receptionist who guided her to the elevator. Taking a deep breath, Sandra pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator doors slid shut, and as she slowly ascended, she couldn't help but replay the events of the flight in her mind. She had made a grave mistake, one that had humiliated her, but now, standing in the lobby of a billionaire's office building, she felt like she was being given a second chance. When the elevator doors opened, Sandra stepped out into a sleek, modern office space. Glass walls overlooked the city, and the atmosphere was one of quiet professionalism. She was led into a conference room where David was already waiting. "Hello, Sandra," David greeted her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came." Sandra felt a twinge of nervousness but smiled back. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I'm still a little unsure of what to expect." David chuckled softly. "It's okay to be nervous, but we're not here for business as usual. I want you to tell me your story, Sandra. Who are you, really?" Sandra sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted her background, the struggles, the dreams she had once held on to, and the path she had chosen to become a flight attendant. She told him how she had always prided herself on being non-judgmental, only to realize in one quick moment that her preconceived notions had clouded her actions. David listened intently, his eyes focused and kind. "Mistakes are a part of life," he said after a long pause. But they don't define us. What matters is what we do next. The conversation continued for hours, and with each passing minute, Sandra felt her fears slowly melting away. David wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a mentor who genuinely cared about helping others grow. By the end of the meeting, Sandra felt a sense of clarity that she hadn't felt in a long time. David had given her more than just an opportunity to learn. He had shown her the value of growth, of taking responsibility, and of using her experiences to help others. As the meeting came to a close, Sandra stood to leave, feeling a strange sense of empowerment. David walked her to the elevator, shaking her hand firmly as she stepped inside. "Remember," he said with a smile, "it's not where you start that matters. It's where you finish." Sandra left the building with a new sense of purpose. The weeks that followed were filled with personal growth and change. She began to actively seek out opportunities to educate herself, attending seminars and workshops on leadership, emotional intelligence, and how to combat biases. She even started a mentorship program for younger flight attendants, helping them navigate the challenges of the industry with empathy and understanding. Meanwhile, David continued his work in the business world, but he never forgot the moment when he had made the decision to reach out to Sandra. He had been in her shoes once, facing judgment and assumptions based on nothing but appearances. He knew the importance of giving people a second chance and believed that everyone deserved the opportunity to learn and improve. One afternoon, David received an unexpected email from Sandra. It was brief but powerful. "Thank you for believing in me. I've taken the first step toward becoming the person I know I can be, and I'm doing it for those who need someone to believe in them." David smiled as he read the email, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He knew that this was just the beginning for Sandra, that she had the potential to impact the world in ways she never imagined. The next time their paths crossed, it was in a much different setting. Sandra had been invited to speak at a leadership conference for women in aviation. As she stood before a crowd of young, eager faces, she knew she was no longer the same person who had made that mistake on the plane. She was someone who had grown, who had learned from her mistakes, and who was now passing that wisdom on to others. David was sitting in the back of the room, watching her with a proud smile. She had come full circle, and her journey was far from over. The final act of redemption. It had been a few months since Sandra had taken the first steps toward a new life, but the road to redemption wasn't always easy. She'd faced challenges, self-doubt, a few setbacks, and the lingering fear that people would never forget the mistake she made on the flight. But every day, she pressed forward, encouraged by the people who had supported her, especially David. One morning, Sandra received a call that would change everything. It was from the same airline that had once employed her as a flight attendant. The voice on the other end of the phone was familiar yet businesslike. "Hello, Sandra. This is Karen from HR at Aircrest Airlines. We've been following your progress, and we'd like to offer you a position to head up our new diversity and inclusion initiative. It's a chance for you to help us create a more welcoming environment for both employees and passengers." Sandra's heart raced. She had never imagined a call like this would come. For years, she had worked on improving herself, and now someone had recognized her potential. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "This is incredible." Karen chuckled. "We've seen how much you've grown and how passionate you are about making a real change. You're the perfect person for the job." A few days later, Sandra met with the airline's top executives. She had prepared for this meeting, but no amount of preparation could calm her nerves. As she sat across from the leaders of Aircrest Airlines, she couldn't help but think about her journey. The rejection, the lessons, and the people who had guided her along the way. She owed so much to David, who had seen beyond her mistake and believed in her when no one else had. The meeting went better than Sandra could have imagined. They were impressed by her ideas for creating training programs that would address racial biases and improve communication between passengers and flight attendants. They were especially moved by Sandra's personal story, her ability to turn a negative experience into a powerful mission for change. By the end of the meeting, Sandra had been offered the position. She accepted without hesitation, knowing this was a chance to make a real impact. This wasn't just about her career anymore. This was about creating a world where mistakes were seen as opportunities to grow, and where no one was judged by their appearance or background. As the days turned into weeks, Sandra threw herself into her new role. She worked tirelessly to create workshops for the staff, focusing on empathy, anti-racism, and emotional intelligence. She also created a mentorship program, pairing new flight attendants with experienced mentors to guide them through the challenges of the job. The changes she was making were small but significant, and they began to ripple out, affecting not just the employees, but the passengers as well. Sandra also stayed in close contact with David, updating him on her progress. He was proud of her, but more than that, he was inspired. Watching Sandra transform her life, and the lives of others, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One day, Sandra sent him a message that left him speechless. "I wanted to thank you, David. You helped me see something I couldn't see myself, that every person, no matter their past, has the power to change. And I'm doing that every day now, not just for myself, but for everyone who crosses my path." David smiled as he read her words. It had been a long journey for both of them, but this was the true reward. The ripple effect of one act of kindness, one second chance, spreading out into the world. As the months passed, Sandra's reputation grew. She was invited to speak at conferences, to share her story with others, and to inspire those who were still struggling to find their way. She became a role model, not just for flight attendants, but for anyone who had ever made a mistake and wondered if they could ever rise above it. One evening, as Sandra stood before a crowd at a leadership conference, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. The nervous flight attendant who had made a costly mistake was now a leader, someone who had the power to influence change, to break down barriers, and to show others that redemption was possible. As Sandra finished her speech, the crowd erupted into applause. She looked out at the sea of faces, and in that moment, she knew she had found her purpose. She had taken her mistake, her greatest humiliation, and transformed it into something that would benefit others for years to come. David was once again in the audience. This time, he wasn't just watching her. He was witnessing the incredible impact of her journey. The woman he had mentored had become a beacon of hope, not just for herself, but for others who believed they were too far gone to change. As the applause continued, Sandra felt a deep sense of peace. She had come full circle. She had redeemed herself. And now, it was her turn to help others redeem themselves too.